focusing more closely on research and adoptions, and also an historical mystery set in the aftermath of the Glendale Revolution, the Crofters' revolt against oppression by their landlords, set in the late 1880s.
That's it.
Yeah. I'll hand you over to Gill if she doesn't mind coming in. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I've been looking forward to meeting you all for ages. I think this is one of the biggest groups of people I've talked to for a while. That's I actually wrote that biography, and I've just made myself sound like a massive geek. So I think I should have put a few more interesting things in that weren't related to the subject. What I've been invited to talk to you about today is the book on the women's history of Liverpool that I wrote. As you've heard, my interest is primarily people who are not well known, who, if it wasn't for researchers like myself and family historians and local historians, would just disappear into the mists of history. So ordinary people, by and large, who did amazing things but get forgotten because more famous people take precedent in the history books quite often. So what I'm planning to do today is talk around, oh, excuse me, is the dog coming in the room, the joys of working from home, is talk about one or two of the themes that I used in the Women's History of Liverpool, and not all of them because there just wouldn't be time, and give you one or two examples and maybe drop in one or two bits and pieces about what it's like to try and research a project like that. And then at the end, so it's up to you, Rona, to just shut me up because I'm a bit of a waffler. So just shut me up when you want me to, and then I'll take questions, and I won't be at all offended
I'm
because
enjoying you already.
Sorry?
You carry on. I'm enjoying you already.
So, rather than you having to look at my ugly mug for the next half an hour, whatever it is, or 40 minutes, I've put some slides together. So, am I able to share the screen and get the slides up?
Or you should be able to. I've given you the access to do it, so you should be
right.
Able to.
Okay, right. Good.
Can I just,
power is good. We like to have power.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Just going to jump in and just say we will be recording this as well, by the way, folks. So if anybody doesn't want to be seen, just knock your cameras off. Yeah. Okay. Oh, look, they all disappear. Yeah. Isn't that amazing?
Right. Here we are. So I'll just check. Hold on a minute. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yeah, somebody's nodding. Yeah, thumbs up. That's great. Fantastic. Well, just in case you are interested, at all good online bookstores, including Blackwell's, Waterstones, National Archives, presumably Museum of Liverpool, and everywhere else. These are the three books that I've currently got out there in print. The follow-up book on the history of adoption obviously is a work in progress at the moment. And as you can see, my interest is very much ordinary people and people who may have struggled for some particular reason in the past. And the most recent one is the history of women's lives in Liverpool. And I wanted that book to be, originally the remit from the publisher was it had to be all about, suffragettes and people who, generally speaking, were the movers and shakers and suffragettes. Not all of them, obviously, but a lot of the more important ones in Liverpool were fairly middle class. So Eleanor Rathbone, who's a very well-known figure in Liverpool's women's activities and movement, but was also very middle class and affluent, is exactly that sort of person. And I wanted to write a book that was a bit more accessible than that was about all women, that was about women who could barely scrape by, who had to struggle to look after their homes, who worked 12, 14, 16, 18 hours a day as domestic servants and that sort of thing. So I must admit I did tweak the remit from the publisher a bit. I think they just had to go with it because they couldn't stop me. So that's what I did, and there's lots and lots of stories in the book about just ordinary women. And there's one or two that I'm going to highlight in particular who were activists, but not somebody that you will ever have heard of, I don't think. So that phrase, just about managing, is something that the vast majority of certainly working class women in Liverpool, as in every other city and many towns as well in the 19th and 20th centuries, had to do. And I know it's a modern phrase, but I just couldn't resist it really. And as you know, up to 1948, we had no health service that was free at the point of delivery. We had no social services as such. We had a version of relief for the poor, but it wasn't the same as what we've got now by any means at all. And so an awful lot of people didn't have really anything to access in order to keep them out of the gutter and the workhouse. So it was a case of being pretty clever with what you had. And it was nearly always the woman who had to deal with the management of the budget on whatever either her husband gave her, or even if he gave her all of his wage at the end of the week, whatever it was. And in about 1900, the average semi-skilled worker, a male worker, was earning approximately £1 a week. If he was semi-skilled, then he would be earning a little bit more than that. So it was not a lot of money because most of that went on rent, and you had to be very, very clever housewife, as they would have called themselves, to try and make that money last through to the end of the week and round to the next payday. Because one of the things they had to pay every week without fail, apart from rent, was something towards the funeral fund. Because if you've got 9 or 10 children, and let's say this is about 1880, 1890, and you're living in very, very poor housing, let's say off the Scotty Road or up by the docks in Liverpool, which was equally very poor quality housing, then the infant mortality was extremely high. And as a mark of respectability, you wanted to be able to bury your babies with all due reverence. So everybody paid in to a funeral fund. So that was like a non-negotiable thing. It almost came before buying the food because it was respectability. We'll come back to the respectability thing in a minute. But one of the things that I found particularly interesting about working class women in cities like Liverpool is this funny sort of almost like a business thing that they all tried to get up and running. So what we've got here in this picture on the left, where there's a little boy with no shoes on, is a sort of a street market. And I think it's a combination of people who would have had stalls and were there regularly selling bits and pieces, and also people who've just brought stuff that they managed to get hold of, accumulate stuff out of their house if they're really short of money, and they've laid it out on the road hoping somebody will come along and buy something. And what women used to do is on a Monday, when they'd got a little bit of money left from the husband's wages that he brought home on a Saturday lunchtime, is they'd go down the rag market and they'd rummage through all the clothes that were there, all the second-hand clothes. And if she was really quite clever, she would find some clothes, like, let's say, a pile of men's shirts that were in not too bad a condition. They might be a bit grubby, they might need a bit of a repair here and there. And she'd pay, let's say, sixpence for them. And she'd take them home, she'd give them a good laundry, because Monday was laundry day, and she'd fix them up, she'd put a button on here and there where they needed it, and then she'd take them down to the pawn shop. And she'd probably pawn them for, let's say, double that amount. So perhaps a shilling or 1 and twopence, something like that. So for those of you that aren't as ancient as me, that is the equivalent a shilling of 5p today. But to them, it was quite a lot of money. So she'd actually made a profit by taking these second-hand items to the pawn shop. Now, obviously, with a pawn shop, normally you would go back and get the stuff. You'd redeem it when you thought you had the money to get them back. But she wouldn't go back for them because she'd already made a profit. She effectively sold on the goods to the pawnbroker, and she was never going to go back and redeem them. It would be different, of course, if she'd had to pawn her wedding ring or husband's best boots that he wore to the chapel on a Sunday, or sometimes his toolkit if they were very poor and he was out of work, or her best petticoat or whatever it was. She'd have to go and get those back. But they had all these funny little ways of trying to make money. The other thing they could do, of course, and it was a very, very popular thing to do in Liverpool, was to go basket selling. So you'd either have a basket on your back with straps over your shoulders, or you'd have a great big, what to us might be a decorative basket, but it wasn't like that for them. And you'd go down to the docks, you'd buy a load of fresh fish, or maybe not quite so fresh, and you'd go around the streets trying to sell it. And if you could persuade them, you would take your smallest children with you, because that was like a sort of a sob story. And you could say to people, look, if you don't buy a couple of my herrings, then I'm not going to be able to feed these lovely children tonight. Unfortunately, some of them used to get a bit carried away and they used to threaten people. So it was like selling fish with menaces. And some of them managed to sell it and some didn't, because they were known for having fish that was on the turn. But this is desperation when you think about it. You would do anything and everything to try and make ends meet. So when I've said there just about managing, actually that's not really true for a lot of women, especially at the bottom end of Liverpool society, if you like. It was a case of just about coping, not really managing. So I was talking about respectability, and this is what they call a court at the back of Clayton Street in Liverpool. And if you look closely at this picture, there's a couple of things to observe. So this is about, I would say this is about 1910, this picture. So look first of all at the poor quality of the building. Look at the way that outhouse, it's probably an outside privy, has been built. It is literally crumbling, and so is the brickwork up here. It's got cracks in it and so forth. The windows are absolutely filthy. There's one there that's broken and so on. And if you look at the two women here, it's hard to tell with the man. I feel sorry for the bird, by the way, but I'll just have to ignore that. You look at this here, look how dirty that woman's apron is. And you might think to yourself, good grief, why doesn't she get that off and give it a wash? The thing is, how would somebody like her give her clothes a wash in a court where it might well be that there's one hand pump, even at this time in Liverpool, for sharing water out amongst a group of houses? It might be in a court of, let's say, a dozen, 15 properties. They might be one up, one down, they might be shared occupancy bigger. That's you've only got about 2 or 3 soil privies that the night soil man would empty periodically. How can you stay clean under those circumstances? And this is one of the things that commentators, middle and upper class commentators, didn't take into account always. The fact that it's extremely difficult to be clean under those circumstances. And yet, it was a real mark of respectability for working class women to keep their families clean. So these women are in a real difficult situation. In order to be able to clean your front doorstep, in order to be able to clean your apron, wash your children, and so forth, wash your windows, which had to be done very regularly because of the very sooty atmosphere. You needed water, and if you haven't got water, then that puts you lower than low. So I think for most women, what they strive towards was not being well off, was not being rich, was not being posh, but just to be respectable. One of the reasons Rowan asked me for how you come to write, or how I've come to write the books that I've written. Well, my partner is from Liverpool, and she's adopted, hence the adoption book as well. And when we met her birth mother, she said to me once, she's actually from Birkenhead, but she's lived in Liverpool for, gosh, about 60 years. And she said to me, they can take anything away from you, but they can't take away your respectability. So that's what working class women work towards, was being respectable. The one that had the cleanest kitchen table in the street was top dog. The one that had the cleanest curtains was top dog. And that's how they they tried to strive for some status within their community because that's all they had. They couldn't put fancy clothes on, they couldn't go to the theatre and sit in a box, they couldn't have meat every night on the table, but they could be respectable, and that was really important to them. I put this picture in here. This is a mother and daughter from Liverpool, and this is what they call a studio photograph. I would date it at about 1880, something like that. So that's probably a tiny little photograph about the size of a credit card called a carte de visite. And I put it in because of this respectability thing, because look how smart and clean that mother and daughter are. They don't live in Clayton Street. That's very clear. So they're very much a little bit above that. They're sort of, I would say, aspirant working class, and they're in their Sunday best. And every family would aspire to have one photograph like that, where they're all dressed up. Sometimes you could borrow clothes from the photographer as well to make yourself look a bit smarter. But the idea was that they had something to say to people when it was on your mantelpiece. Look how respectable we are. Look how clean and tidy we are. Look how well we look after ourselves. And look how well I look after my children. And as you go through the 19th century, that is still important. And even into like the era of my mother-in-law's lifetime, she was born in 1926, that was still important to her. And she experienced crushing poverty, even in the 1950s, when the children were little and she had to have them adopted out because of that crushing poverty. But one of the things that enabled people to add a little bit of ambition to that respectability was universal education for children. Now, in 1870, there was an Act of Parliament passed which established the principle of universal education for all children up to the age of 10. No matter how poor the child was, it could have access to school education through what they called a board school. However, between 1870 and 1880, when they passed another Act for Education, in that 10 years, an awful lot of girls did not attend school. And that was because they were needed at home. They couldn't be spared because they had to help with the chores. They might have had to help in a family shop or business or something like that. And they just could not afford to have their daughters educated. And that is why they passed another Act of Parliament 10 years later, in order to make sure that all children, regardless, went to school, whether they were boy or girl, whatever was going on at home, you had to go. And if you didn't, the school board man would be knocking on the door and you'd all be hiding in the kitchen, away from him. So you can see in this picture here, which is Lister Drive School, which is not far from Old Swan in Liverpool. Look at the size of that school hall. It's absolutely massive. And here's all the girls here on this side, and here's all the boys there, because the education of boys and girls in a lot of schools was separated. Sometimes they had separate entrances and then they'd be taught together. In other schools, it was separate. And there's a lot of dispute over whether mixed gender or separate gender schools are the right thing. Nowadays, it seems to be the majority opinion that mixed gender schools are preferable. But certainly at this time, it was thought that girls were better educated separately, because these little girls in Old Swan, they would be preparing them to be wives and mothers, or maybe to go into domestic service, to be a maid in somebody's house. The boys would be educated to have a job. So these little girls would learn what they called housewifery, how to be respectable, how to look after your house well when you got married. So they'd learn how to sew a baby's layette, so that when they left school, they already had a whole set of clothes ready for when they had the first baby, and they left school at 12. They would have cookery lessons, so they knew how to do wholesome cooking for the family. And of course, they'd be able to read and write, but they were being educated to be good wives and mothers, essentially. And, you know, the expectation was that they would marry relatively young, certainly in their 20s, and if they didn't, people would wonder what was wrong with them. And having said that, you know, the boys are equally straitjacketed. They were probably taught something like metalwork or woodwork, in the odd school, maybe a little bit of technical drawing, and then they'd be sent out to work in the docks, to work in the various factories, and so on. And there wasn't really much in the way of aspiration for these working class children. But at the same time, at least now, they are receiving some sort of education, which they weren't before. And of course, you would go to Sunday school as well on a Sunday, because that was expected of you also. So, having said that they were being trained to be wives and mothers, obviously they had to work until they got married. Middle class girls certainly didn't. They might do a little bit of voluntary work or something like that, or they might work for one of the local political parties, the Liberals or the Tories or whatever, but they certainly wouldn't go out and graft as working class girls had to. And this woman here is a newspaper seller in Liverpool. So I would imagine she put her money in her tied up apron there, and that's her big sheaf of newspapers. That's a relatively respectable street selling trade for a woman at the time. This one is quite interesting actually, because these are girls in one of the big tobacco factories in Liverpool, and they employed thousands of women and girls from the end of the 19th century right through into the 20th century. I don't know how many of you are from Liverpool, but there used to be a very famous billboard in Liverpool, which was for Ogden's tobacco, and it had a pipe sticking out of it with smoke puffing out of it. Can you imagine them being allowed to advertise that today? You'd just never get away with it, would you? But it was a massive employer of girls and women, and some married women as well, because once they trained the girls up to make the cigars, to roll the cigarettes, which in the early days were all rolled by hand. Can you imagine that? The hundreds and thousands of cigarettes coming out of one of these big factories, all rolled by hand. It's phenomenal. And they worked through all the different processes, from the tobacco coming into the port at Liverpool, being taken to these huge factories, which ran for something like a quarter of a mile down one of the roads. And obviously, it all had to be sorted through, it had to be shredded, it had to be cleaned, and then it would go off into the different departments for sorting and production. And it's interesting actually when you have a look at some of the I'm going to have to find the right page now in all my many post-it notes in the book, but it's fascinating to see how these young women were referred to in the articles that were written about the tobacco industry, which was well known throughout the country, really, as something that was very prominent in Liverpool. And they were talked about as being very respectable young ladies, and that they each had their little workstation and they'd have little pictures and trinkets on it to decorate it. And you could tell which girls were the best workers because they had the tidiest work table and things like that. And if you did get married, then until you had children, you were allowed to stay on and work there. The majority of work, they wouldn't want you to stay on. And certainly in domestic service, if you were a maid or something like that, then if you did get married, or even if you got yourself a boyfriend, then that was instant dismissal, because they were worried you'd get pregnant, and that would just be an embarrassment to your employer. So these girls that worked in these big factories like that, well, it was relatively clean, and certainly preferable to working in the jam and pickle factories in Liverpool, because you came out smelling of onions from them. Um, then, you know, if you could get in one of these, then that was a really good thing, and something to boast about. And the pay was not too bad either. Having said that, an awful lot of women were doing stuff at the other end of the production process. And one of the worst paid things you could do was be what they called a bag woman. Now, that sounds to us like a derogatory term for somebody who lives on the street. But a bag woman was actually somebody who made and repaired the millions of sacks that were used on the docks to move goods about. And she was actually very important because without her, they couldn't have moved the goods about in those days. But unfortunately, it was considered to be the lowest of the low that did that work, and the pay was just absolutely abysmal. The alternative to that, if you couldn't get out of your, I was going to say your house, that's a bit of a posh term for some of the accommodation in Liverpool for women who were for living in cellars and attics and that sort of thing. The other thing you could do, of course, is outwork, and that might be the famous matchbox making. It might be um, covering buttons. It could be feather curling, safety pin bending, making fancy boxes, all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And the pay for that was equally abysmal. And that's why you see these pictures, if you have a route about on the internet or in history books, of whole families making big piles of matchboxes. Because if the children didn't get involved, then there wouldn't be any point doing it because you just wouldn't get any money out of it at all. So there's a kind of almost like a pecking order in terms of the work that women did in Liverpool. So you've got obviously the tobacco workers fairly high up because it was clean and respectable and fairly well paid, down through to the outworking and the bag women at the bottom. But I think any type of factory work was preferable to being a domestic servant, because if you think about it, if you are the only domestic servant in a middle class Victorian house, you've maybe come from a lovely rural part of North Wales or Staffordshire or sometimes even Shropshire, perhaps Cumbria, something like that, or Cheshire possibly, and you've gone into this house, you are the only person doing all the domestic work. So you're having to get up before your employer gets up, 4:30, 5:30 in the morning. You're not allowed to go to bed until they go to bed, because you've got to set the fires before you go to bed as well. So you might not get to bed till midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. You've got to do all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the errands, everything else. That is really, really very taxing. And a lot of these domestic servants who were on their own in those circumstances suffered from quite serious mental health issues. They were isolated, they were lonely, they couldn't get to see their families, and they sent a lot of their money home to families. And quite a few of them used to end up in the local lunatic asylum, as they were known then, what we would now refer to as some sort of mental health facility, suffering from breakdowns, depression, that sort of thing. And they could be nursed back to health because, even in 1890, they were quite good at helping people be nurtured out of depression and minor breakdowns and things like that. But what are you going to go back to? You're going to go straight back to the life that you know. And so you're going to end up in the same position. So you can imagine why factory work, where you've got company, where you've got set hours, where you're going in, you know what you're doing every day, and where there are campaigns from trade unions as time goes by to improve conditions, where you've got the opportunity to strike and have your say in order to make your mark on what you want to happen, compared to a domestic servant that was much more preferable. So that is partly why, as you go through into the 20th century, being a domestic servant was increasingly unpopular. And as they say in some of the soap operas and things like Downton Abbey, well, you just can't get the staff anymore. And they couldn't because nobody wanted to do it. And can you blame them? So this is the sort of thing that women were doing instead of domestic service. This is the staff photograph. I love this picture of the Central Cafe near Lime Street Station in Liverpool. And it was quite a well-known cafe, and it's upmarket. And you've got all the staff here. All but one of them is female. You can see they've shoved the man at the back. He's there. I don't know who he is, whether he's the manager or what, but everybody else is female. So you've got front of house staff, and then you've got the waiting on staff. I think these must be the kitchen girls and the chef and so on. And I love all this here, the Lancashire hot pot and so on. It's really fantastic picture. It just says such a lot. And one of the things I like about it is that they're all smiling and they look as though they've got a sense of camaraderie. Much more preferable to do that, even though it's such hard work. You know, working in hospitality, as we call it now, is really, really tough on your feet. It's exhausting, it's long hours, but they're together. And, you know, they're not stuck in somebody else's house being told what to do left, right, and centre. And they look to me as though they're proud of being in that group. And to me, that picture says a lot. And as you go through into the 20s and 30s, you have got much more in the way of choice for working class women in terms of more acceptable occupations to do. So I can't really talk about work and women in Liverpool without looking at the pools. This is Jane Seymour's Liverpool, where they did the Little Woods pools. And this is one of the absolutely massive, well, what would you call it? It's not an office, is it? It's a space where all the all-female clerks who worked for Little Woods pools used to check the pools coupons when they came in. So all these women will be sat there for 8 or 9 hours a day, going through. I don't know how many of you remember the pools. My mum used to do the pools religiously every week, and spot the ball as well, but that's a slightly different thing. Um, and you know, there were millions of these things that had to be checked each week. And this again was clean, respectable clerical work that women could do whether they were married or not. And it was quite a desirable place to work, in fact. And John Moore was considered to be a pretty good employee. And I'm going to tell you a couple of stories about this young woman here. This is Dora Carter, as she later became. She was born Dora Davenport, very, very typical young woman from Liverpool. She was born in 1916. Her father was from Antrim in Northern Ireland, and her mother was from up by, where was it now? Somewhere near Runcorn, I think. And but her mother was called Kennedy, so of Irish descent as well, because as you know, Liverpool is a very diverse place. And she went to an elementary school, as they were called. I came from a big family of something like 9 or 10 children. And it was tough. They had a tough upbringing, but a respectable one. And she managed to get herself a job as the lift girl at Jane Seymour's. So that meant she used to have to sit. Again, a lot of you won't remember this, I don't think, but you used to have somebody sat in a lift on a little stool, and they would operate the lift going up and down. So you tell them what floor you wanted to go to, and she would let people in and out, and they have the concertina metal gate on it. And she was a very ambitious young girl, and bear in mind she's about 16 by this time. And she was studying at night school, as a lot of working class young people did at the time, to do secretarial work. She didn't want to be stuck in a lift for the rest of her working life till she got married. So she used to keep her books in the lift with her, and she used to look at them when there was nobody wanted to be going up and down the building. And then one day, John Moores and his colleague got into the lift, and she had to take him up to the directorial suite. And he said to her, what are those books you've got there? So she got them out and she showed them to him, and he said, you're a bit ambitious then, are you? You want to do a bit better than be a lift girl? And she said, yes, I do. She said, and one day I am going to be a shorthand typist in this company. Now that to her was a big thing to achieve, because she'd come from this very, very poor family. So to be a secretary, as she saw it, was really something, and she was determined to get there. So he had to flip through the books, and he looked her up and down, and he said, all right then, okay, come up and see me after my lunch break, and we'll see what we can do. And he was as good as his word, because he actually got her moved into the typing pool, where she learnt to type, and she got all her secretarial skills. So that's quite interesting, because you tend to think of these men and sometimes women who ran these massive companies as being disinterested in what was going on around them. But he actually was interested. And the fact that she had shown some interest in doing something else sparked his imagination, because he was a self-made man. And that's why he helped her. Now we're going to come back to Dora a little bit later on, because she also was an activist. She had a lot about her. So I thought we'd just have a little bit of a look at activism in Liverpool. Liverpool is renowned for being a city that is proud of its activism, of its radicalism, and quite rightly so. And we've got quite a contrast here in these two pictures, because on the left, the picture from 1968 is not the women from Dagenham who struck for, as it's usually known, equal pay, but it was actually for a different type of grading for their work. But the women from Fort in Halewood, who struck at the same time in solidarity with the women from Dagenham. And they were doing exactly the same sort of work. They were making the car seat covers and that sort of thing. And they also managed to achieve a change in the grading for their work. And it's quite interesting, really, because they tend to get overlooked because the Dagenham story is so well known. But they were out at exactly the same time. And again, what I love about that picture is their smiling faces. You know, they're not doing this because obviously they were angry, but they're not doing this because anybody's forcing them into it. They're doing it because they're taking control of their own destiny, and nobody's forced them to strike or anything like that. They're doing it because it's the right thing to do. I think it's a terrific picture. And the ladies on the other side are some Liverpool suffragettes. As I said to you before, a lot of the suffragettes tended to be, certainly the leaders of the suffrage movement, tended to be middle class ladies, quite often supported by their husbands, because obviously women didn't have the vote, so they couldn't vote anything into Parliament. And they tended to be already politically active, and they had the education, the confidence, they were articulate in order to start these campaigns and then move them along. And these are very, very typical ladies who would do that sort of thing. But I mean, there was violent suffragism in Liverpool at the time, because I forget which one it was now, actually put a bomb, an incendiary bomb, under one of the stands at Aintree Racecourse. And it had to be dismantled by the police before they could reopen the course. So, I mean, things like breaking windows, setting fire to letterboxes, and that sort of thing actually was happening in Liverpool at the time. Well, there's also a lot of very understated political campaigning going on, persuasion, talking to the right people, getting your husband to talk to the right people, because, as I say, they didn't always have access to the corridors of power. And that was the advantage of having these women involved in the Votes for Women movement, because they had access to, if you like, the right people. What working class women could bring to the suffrage movement was radicalism, was the power to move it along faster, was a sort of an urgency that maybe the middle class women didn't have. Because I think for a lot of working class women, they saw a move towards women having the vote as a way of improving conditions in other ways. So it wasn't just about having a vote, it was about improving lives right down to the bottom rung of society. Now, this is quite interesting. I don't know whether any of you are family historians, but this is the 1911 census for a property in Birkenhead. And it's for the property of a doctor, a female doctor, who was originally from Scotland, and she was called Alice Kerr, and she lived on the Wirral for a while, And Alice Davies, who you can see there, just on the second row there of the census return, rented the house from Dr. Kerr, and she opened it up for the accommodation of suffragettes on the night of the census. Now, you would probably have heard stories about people like Emily Wilding Davison, who hid in a cupboard in Parliament on the night of the census. Well, on the night of the census in 1911, something like 32 women were hiding in this house on the Wirral at the time. A lot of them were suffragettes from Liverpool. And I don't think you can just about read there. If I just enlarge the screen a bit, if it'll go, it won't. It says the above mentioned Alice Davies rented this house from Dr. Alice Kerr for a week from Friday the 31st of March 1911, and it was open for the accommodation of suffragettes on census night. And I am informed, that's the enumerator saying this, there were 32 females on the premises, particulars of whom I am unable to obtain, but which we included in totals on the schedule. So there is something like probably anything up to 40 women hiding in this property. Now, how many rooms has it got? Let's just have a look. I can't quite see that, but 38 persons they've got in 11 rooms, and they wouldn't let the enumerator in to get their names or anything like that. So that's the sort of activism they were doing at the beginning of the 20th century. Don't know who they were. It'd be lovely to know, wouldn't it? But I don't think we'll ever find out. So it wasn't all about breaking windows or talking to the right people. They were always doing this sort of, what shall we say, irritation. It was just sort of needling the authorities all the time. So, have you heard of somebody called Margaret Bevan, who was the first female mayor of Liverpool? Now, this looks a bit of a strange picture. She looks as though she's potholing. That's Margaret in the middle there. This is the moment when they broke through the last bit of stone between the two halves of the Mersey Tunnel, coming from the Wirral one way and from Liverpool the other way. And she was one of the drivers and movers of the Liverpool Tunnel project. Sadly, she never actually saw it come to fruition because she died. I think she died of pneumonia about 3 years before it was actually formally open, but she was there when the tunnel was actually broken through. So she knew it was going to happen. And she was known at the time, affectionately, might sound a bit patronising now, as the little mother of Liverpool, because she was not only interested in these big civic projects, and this changed the relationship between the Wirral and Liverpool forever, because it meant people who had access to a bus or a car or commercial vehicle could go to and fro from the Wirral to Liverpool so easily. You weren't reliant on any sort of ferry or anything like that, or of actually driving round. And it opened up the Wirral to becoming almost like a suburb of Liverpool in a way for affluent workers. So she was responsible partly for that. Well, here's another picture of her taking a box of goodness knows what stuff, goodies, I don't know, to a poor family in Liverpool. Now, they don't look that poor to me. They're not compared to lots of other families, and they've actually managed to hang on to things like pictures on the wall and so forth, because, you know, in some families that would all have been sold. But that was the sort of wide interest that she had. She wanted everybody in Liverpool to gain from the improvements of the city. And by the time you get to the 1930s, it was starting to slowly improve. A lot of the really dreadful accommodation that was down by the docks and so forth was being swept away. Most houses had access at some point to at least cold water. So things, that sounds terrible, but it was an improvement on what had been before. And she was one of the people that encouraged these welfare improvements. There was a lot of women's projects. Eleanor Rathbone who I mentioned before, was very involved in those as well. So there were women's projects to help mothers and babies. There were refuges for women who were destitute or were suffering abuse and that sort of thing. So all over Liverpool, apart from all these women that were striving and working and trying to be respectable and trying to get their daughters educated and just trying to improve their lives little by little as best they could, you've also got women in positions of power who were trying to do it from the top down. Now, Margaret Bevan did not come from a particularly affluent background. Eleanor Rathbone did. So, there were women from all levels of society trying to do their bit. I'm not saying that's particularly unusual. You would get that in any big city. But I think in Liverpool, there seems to be, I don't know, there's a sort of a vitality about what they were doing. And I think because it's a fairly small city, even today, in this grand scheme of things, and because it's quite compact, it's almost like this sort of firework box of things happening all the time. And that sort of political radicalism and impetus, I mean, you can see it today in Liverpool on a regular basis. Oh, now one thing I will. Oh yes. Wait a minute. I'm just going to go back to this. I didn't mention to you about Dora Carter's other piece of activism. So I'm just going to come out the share because I want to show you something. Right, this doesn't come up very big, but I'll do my best with it. Now, I said to you that Dora Davenport, later Carter, was an activist. And what you might not know is that in 1939, 1940, obviously when the Second World War started, it was considered to be inappropriate by the government for pools companies to continue with the work that they were doing because they didn't want people gambling away what bit of money they had on the pools and other things like it. So they stopped it and they said to companies like Littlewood's Pools, you're going to have to find something else to do. Get yourself involved in more work because this is just not, appropriate for the circumstances. So all those thousands, and I'm talking about thousands of young women who were working at Jane Seymour's, Littlewood's Pools, Vernon's Pools, all the rest of it, lost their jobs virtually overnight. And Dora was one of them. And she and a few of her friends did not take it lying down because their money was really important to families like hers. She needed her wage to take home to her mother because she was one of the oldest in the family and she had younger siblings to support as well. So she was absolutely livid that she had been put in the position of losing her job, of letting her mother down because her mother was a widow, of letting her siblings down. The sort of family that was striving so hard to be respectable and to do the right thing by each other. So they started a campaign. I think there was 3 or 4 of them, including Dora. And they hired a room. They sent word out amongst all the girls that they were going to have a meeting. And they got themselves this room. And there were so many people turned up that they were spilled out all over the streets. And it just snowballed. And they ended up hitting the national press. They ended up going down to Parliament as a delegation. They actually presented a petition at 10 Downing Street. And what they wanted was a job. They didn't want, at the beginning of a war, when everything was so perilous and uncertain, to be left with absolutely nothing, on the dole with nothing to do. And there were thousands of girls, all with a similar skill set, all trying to get jobs in Liverpool at the time. And this is a scan of one of the speeches that Dora wrote that she was going to give. They did quite a number of these organised events. So this is one of her speeches. And she actually worked it out with her later husband, who was called Nelson Carter. And she typed it. There's quite a few mistakes in it. I'm sure she was a better typist than this, really. And he helped her write the words. And what she's actually demanding on behalf of the girls is some sort of training, a retraining scheme with pay, so that they could keep their families fed, but also contribute to the war effort. She's talking about, let me see now, she says, I probably will miss quite a lot of good points, which you will notice. I hope that you will put these forward, as I am just like yourselves, trying to think up some schemes which will be to the benefit of us all. Last week I was more so like yourselves, sitting at home full of despair, because that job which we were all expecting just did not seem to be coming. It sounds as though they were promised some sort of job replacements, and then of course it didn't happen. I suddenly realised that my job would not come along unless I did something about it. So my first move was to attach myself to this organisation for the unity of the unemployed pool girls. Without unity, we can be driven anywhere, but once organised, we can overcome a lot of barriers and suppress individual wrongs, which will and do occur. So she goes on then to talk about the suggestions that she's going to make. And she's saying that training schools for all these thousands of unemployed pools girls should be opened with pay while we are training, she's underlined just here. There we are. And she says, at present, there are people employed for the driving of these vehicles. She's talking about things like ambulances and delivery vehicles, who are not in need of the work as they have sufficient income coming in their homes. Most of these people have their own cars and are well able to drive. Even when you or I were working, we were never in the position to afford driving lessons. Therefore, these people are the only available ones. I feel sure that if the suggestion was put to Mr. Potts, who I think was from the Employment Exchange, he would be no doubt to get these people to teach those that are in need of the work and the wages that us pool girls need. So what she's saying is that they should be taught to drive ambulances instead of people who are doing it as volunteers who don't need the pin money and that sort of thing. And then she's talking about, let me see now, what they should try and avoid is to put 18,000 efficient workers thrown on the dole at a week's notice, and that they ought to be able to find these employees something to do actually at Littlewoods, which they're capable of doing with the skills that they've got, rather than just throwing them on one side. And their organisation was called the Liverpool Pool Girls Committee. She's also talking about things like, why are you letting people in factories do overtime when we've got no job? Why can't you share out the work amongst us? You've got to put a stop to people claiming all these hours of extra work, and we've got no money to take home to our families. So she's angry, she's indignant, she's hurt, and she's doing something about it. Now, I don't really know what happened to a lot of those women. That's an awful lot of women and some men who were thrown on the dole when Littlewoods changed its remit. They went on to make things like barrage balloons, parachutes, paperwork, and printing presses for the government's war efforts, where it couldn't take on all these women. So it was a very difficult position for them all to be in. But she's, like I say, just an ordinary girl. She was ambitious for herself and her family. She was not going to take it lying down. Now, she is the sort of woman that I'm interested in, as opposed to the ones who were born to influence. She is, in fact, I ought to fess up now, my partner's adopted mother. And she was a formidable character. So, just going back to this, we can't say that it was all hard graft in Liverpool or any city at the time. And as you go through the Victorian era and into the 20th century, people did, because of campaigns by organisations, later trade unions and the labour movement, to get people restricted working hours so that they could have some leisure time and some time off. You do start to get facilities emerging for people to be able to use that time off for their advantage and recreation. So a couple of pictures here from the Times. this looks like Blackpool Tower, I know, but actually it's New Brighton on the Wirral. And they had their very own version of a mini Blackpool Tower with a ballroom underneath. Unfortunately, the tower wasn't very well built. It had to be pulled down after not that long. But the ballroom, I think, is still there. That was a very, very popular destination for families, individuals from Liverpool to go for a day out at the time. And then this one is the sort of place where courting couples would go. This is the big farmhouse, the glass house in Sefton Park, which I think about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they completely restored. And it's a beautiful thing to behold. And it's in the middle of a big park, and there are lots of parks in Liverpool. And that would be the sort of place where young women would go to see and be seen, and to go courting and walk out with their chap and all that sort of thing. So alongside all the work, there was leisure. So they were able to take advantage of both. And I couldn't let this go by without a quick word about Aintree and what it was like for a day at the races. And this was a combination of pleasure and work for some women, because right from the beginning, it was one of those forms of recreation that women were actually allowed to attend. It was never thought to be lacking in respectability for women to go to the races. And in fact, they were always very, very rowdy places. You could go there and have a drink, you could have a bit of fun, you could lark about, and you could watch the horses and bet on them if you wanted to. You could also, if you were a prostitute, go and work there. And in the middle of the 19th century, pimps, people who organised prostitutes in the city, used to have a marquee at the races. And it sounds really a bit strange now, but they'd have a massive marquee, and all the sex workers would be in there, all wearing a particular colour of frock. So it's a bit weird, really, because just as you get colours on a racehorse, so the jockey's got certain colours from the trainer, the women will be wearing a certain colour to distinguish themselves. And they would go out of the marquee, the pimps, distribute cards with details of the girls on, and they'd say, come into our marquee and look for, I don't know, Florence in the pink dress. And, she looks like this, and this is what her speciality is, and so on. And gentlemen would go to the races, and they would not only bet on the horses, but they might also go and see the prostitutes in the marquee. And that seems a bit strange, really, but it was one of the ways that sex workers in Liverpool actually could make quite good money when the races were on. So it was a mixture of work and pleasure for different women. And of course, if you were a suffragette, it was something to be set fire to as well. So there was that too. I think that might be, yes, that is the last slide. So, blimey, is that the time? Gosh, I've gone a bit too long, haven't I? Shall I just come out of this now, see if anybody's got any pictures, and I'll come out the share as well. There we are, that's it. So, any questions, anybody? Actually, Rona, you did ask me a question, didn't you? You said, how long does it take to write one of these books?
Yeah. How long does it take to research and write your book?
Well, I think it usually to actually write a book takes from starting it through to actually having the book on the shelf is about 18 months. Because you've got to write it, it's got to go through 3 edits, 3 proofs, then it's got to be printed and distributed. But usually you tend to go for subjects that you're already interested in. So you've already got the background knowledge in it, if you like. So when I wrote the adoption book and the Liverpool book, I'm married to a woman from Liverpool, so I already had an interest in the city. I've already taught women's history, and she's adopted, so I'd already looked into the background to adoption. So they're subjects that I already was invested in, if you like. So you've got a head start, really. And I think if you were going to do a subject that you knew absolutely nothing about, you could still do it, probably in the time frame, but it'd be ever such hard work. And I don't think you'd have that feel for it that you would if you'd already looked into it yourself.
Yeah.
But I would say definitely, in order to pull a book together and get it out there, 18 months to 2 years.
Right, brilliant. Yeah. Well, Gill, you've given us an absolutely unbelievable insight into how people lived, and it makes us see how fortunate we all are, like today.
Yeah.
But we need to come to an end now. And thanks for coming. I'll hand over to
Thank
Karen.
you for having me.
Absolutely brilliant. I love it. I can listen to you all day and night.
If I was allowed to, I probably would go on all day and night as well. So it's a good thing that you stopped me. Yeah.
I'll hand over to Karen, so she can close. Karen, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thanks for that, Rona, and thanks for what you've done tonight. So apologies that we have run over, but we did not want to stop Gill. That was just so fascinating. And I think, as you've just said there, Gill, we could just listen to you all the time. And I'd like to think that we'll be able to do this again sometime, because
absolutely,
I think, the information that's in your books. I mean, I put something in the comments when you mentioned about the the cigarette factory, because I went to an all-girls grammar school. Right, so we were segregated, but we were right next to a flipping tobacco factory, and it stank. Absolutely,
really?
Especially in the summer, wet tobacco. I've never lost that smell, right? But obviously, it wasn't hand rolled and stuff by then. But I think it's fascinating to look back on how women coped in those days, and when you think about it now, women are doing the same thing today. Right,
I'm afraid so.
Exactly, that level of poverty, and okay, we're all in much better housing and stuff, or most of us are, but we know that doesn't apply to everybody. So I think it's been a real, tonight has been a great, evening to really see what happens, what has happened to women in the Northwest, but also in other parts of the country as well. Right, it's given a great overview of different aspects of what women have done over those years. I mean, I have done a historical women's course. I only did one half of it with a guy from the Working Class Movement Library, right? And been fascinated with Michael. I don't know if you know, but it was absolutely fascinating, and the women that I've never even heard of. And we watched things like on YouTube from Pathé News, right? Stuff from the history, right? And there is just so much. The more you look back, the more interesting it gets, isn't it? And I know people have started researching their own family trees and stuff, and it all ties in with that as well. So, for me, it was absolutely fascinating tonight, and I thank you. And I know we're going to be working with you again at the end of the month, because
that's right.
I don't know if Kate's still on, or she's had to drop off, but we've got an event at the end of the month. Oh no, Kate, you're still there. Sorry, I didn't see you up there on the top line. We've got an event at the end of the month that you're working with us on. So when we know we're going to see you again, and I think really just to sort of sum up the week, right? What I'd like to do is just hand over to Carl as our regional secretary, for sort of final words on what we've done. We'll send the slides out to anybody who's asked for them, and we will make sure you get the YouTube links for everybody, who's on there. So thank you, Gill. But
thank you for having me
tonight. It's been fascinating. So over to Carl, and I'll let him close for us.
Yeah, by the way, didn't want to do this because I wanted to leave it to Sheila and Karen, but Sheila bossed me. She had to tell me I had to speak. She actually threatened me. I just want to grass her up, to be honest to everybody. Gill, my nan and mother came from Liverpool. I was going in the 60s, and I remember I was in Highton, Princess Drive, and I remember buses going down the streets late. I found it fascinating. But I remember my nan being so pleased that she told me stories, because she lived in probably places that you pictured, but she lived in a council house. So all these council houses were built, and it was amazing, but it still had an outside toilet.
Yeah.
And they still didn't have bathrooms. They still had the tin baths. And God, I am showing my age. But then everybody has a go at Derek Hatton. And around that time, I think Jane will back me up on this. They started modernising those council houses, and suddenly it was toilets indoor, and people were given proper and decent accommodation. And that, a lot of that came from 1945 when Labour were elected. But then you saw a Labour council in Liverpool doing so much. So I really want to thank you for today. You brought back some lovely memories of my mum and my nan who are not with us anymore. So thank you. I want to finish by thanking Sheila, the amazing Sheila Biggins, who is the driving force for the Regional Women's League, backed up and mentored by, let's be honest, with Karen. I think Sheila will say that. But Sheila's now been let free. She's going and she's doing everything. And you're getting WhatsApp messages from her at 10, 11 o'clock at night saying, Carl, I want to do this. Will you pay this? Can we have this? And it's just fantastic. And I have enjoyed, Dave Kennedy's on the call. Dave is there. Dave is the regional chair. He's been on every call and he supports just as much as I do and what our regional leads do. So Dave has just said he wasn't sure whether he was going to enjoy this, but he said it was absolutely brilliant and fascinating. Good. So I said the same. So we've had 5 events this week. I wasn't sure. I think, well, we've taken on a little bit much here. Sheila has delivered so many fascinating, every speaker, Sheila. And what was really good is today, Rona chairing this meeting, was it the health and safety rep from your office, who was a new health and safety rep who came and spoke. What was her name, Sheila?
Claire, she's on the call now.
Oh, sorry, Claire. Oh God, apologies. I tell you what, it was fantastic, and what it's been doing is bringing people on. It's not the same old faces like mine, new faces, giving them experience. Ronnie, you were amazing today. You Dave Kennedy, out the door now. We've got a new chair, and really, I'm buzzing because those 5 events.
I don't think I was that good though.
Oh, you were good. Every event, we're so proud of what you've done, Karen, Sheila. It's been great. I think every event, and we'll get recordings out. I know Febsy couldn't make a couple of them, and he wants to get the recordings. We'll get that. Once me and Karen have managed to sort out the few technical problems we've got, we'll have the recordings of every event. We'll get them on YouTube, and we'll get the links shared out. So I just want to thank you all. And do you want to come on, Rona? Sorry.
Yeah, please. Can I just say that Karen and Sheila have been fantastic supports the time that I've been doing this, because I was new to it, and they've been great. But can I just see if Kate wants to say anything very, very quickly? Do you want to come in, Kate?
Thank you, Rona, and it's great to see you. The last time I saw you was at Alverscott, so keep in touch. We need to catch up. But I just want to say to everybody, look, unfortunately I couldn't make every night, but I will, just as Febsy, we were talking about this today. Have you got the recording? No, have you got the recording? Because we really want to watch this back. I'm originally from Liverpool, and just Jane and a few others have mentioned, Carl, I'm getting a bit worried. My nan lived down Princess Drive as well. I'm thinking, connection here. so tonight,
that's why we get on so well. That's what it is.
Maybe, but you know what? It takes you out of that virus bubble, doesn't it? And you come out and you learn, so much, and it's been really interesting. And I've just got to say, even when I looked for the link last night and said, can you register me for tonight? Northwest are smashing it. And Sheila, there is no stopping Sheila at the moment. I don't want her to stop. With the support of Karen in the region, absolutely fantastic. And I can't wait to see what comes next. Well done, everybody.
Oh.
And on that note, folks, shall we bid everybody a wonderful weekend, and hope we will see you when we do some more events. Believe me, this is something we're going to carry on with. We are going to look back to going into the face-to-face ones, aren't we, Sheila? We will go back where we can all be together for the day. And, again, we'll get some more fascinating women. And from all those women of today to all those women of today, tomorrow, right, yesterday and the future. Right, okay. Good night, and we will
Bye.
see you soon.
Bye.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Karen,
Thank
Jill,
you.
Thank you,
Sheila. Have a
Jill.
good weekend. It's been
Thank
brilliant.
you.
Everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you for
everyone.
coming on.
Okay.
Bye.
See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you.